Graham Charles had learned, early and painfully, that attention was rarely neutral. It came weighted, with expectation, with judgment, with the unspoken demand that he perform intelligence rather than possess it. So when he stepped into seminar room 4B that autumn afternoon, he chose the back row by instinct. The seat near the tall window. The place where he could observe without being observed. The room smelled faintly of old books and rain-damp coats. Postgraduates murmured to one another, laptops opening, pens tapping. Graham slid into his chair, spine straight, expression carefully composed. This was not his first advanced seminar, nor his first visiting professor. He told himself that this one would be no different. He was wrong. Dr. Ilya Verhoeven entered without ceremony. No dramatic pause. No announcement. Just the soft click of the door and the sudden, collective awareness that the air itself had shifted. Graham looked up, then wished he hadn't. Verhoeven was tall, but not imposing in the way people usually met. There was no aggressive posture, no loud authority. He moved like someone accustomed to being listened to, not because he demanded it, but because silence followed him naturally. His suit was dark, understated. His hair, prematurely silver at the temples, was brushed back with careless precision. But it was his eyes that caught Graham. Not because they were striking in color, they were an unremarkable gray, but because of how they rested. As if they never skimmed the surface of anything. As if they read beneath words, beneath posture, beneath intention. Verhoeven placed his notes on the desk and looked up. His gaze passed over the room in a slow arc, acknowledging students without really seeing them. Graham remained still, practiced at invisibility. He almost succeeded. Then the professor's eyes stopped. Just for a fraction too long. Graham felt it like a hand pressed between his shoulder blades. Verhoeven did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked, measured intent, and something tight and unfamiliar curled low in Graham's chest. The moment stretched, thin as wire, before the professor looked away and began to speak. Literature, Verhoeven said, voice calm, lightly accented, is not a mirror. It is a negotiation. The words should have grounded Graham. Instead, he found himself replaying that glance, dissecting it the way he dissected text. Was it recognition? Curiosity? Or had he imagined the intensity entirely? The seminar unfolded around him. Discussion of power, of subtext, of desire disguised as morality in classic works. Graham listened, fingers curled around his pen, mind sharp and restless. When Verhoeven posed a question to the room, silence followed. Graham raised his hand. He rarely did that on the first day. But something about the way Verhoeven framed authority, as something fluid, unstable, irritated him. Or challenged him. He wasn't sure which. Yes, Verhoeven said immediately. As if he'd been waiting. Graham spoke carefully at first, citing theorists, threading argument through evidence. But as he continued, his confidence sharpened. He dismantled a central assumption in Verhoeven's analysis, not aggressively but cleanly, with precision. When he finished, the room was quiet. Verhoeven did not respond right away. He watched Graham. Openly now. Unapologetically. The silence lengthened, heavy enough that Graham became acutely aware of his own breathing, the faint pulse in his throat. He resisted the urge to look away. He had earned this moment. He would not retreat from it. Finally, Verhoeven spoke. That, he said, is a dangerous interpretation. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Graham's jaw tightened, but then Verhoeven continued. Dangerous, he repeated, because it assumes the character is aware of his own motivations. And that assumption changes everything. Not dismissal. Engagement. Verhoeven turned fully toward him now. Mr. Charles? Graham said. Graham Charles. Mr. Charles? Verhoeven echoed, and something in the way he said the name, slow, deliberate, made Graham's stomach dip. You see conflict where others see inevitability. The professor's gaze sharpened, narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in focus. That tells me you're not satisfied with conclusions handed to you. Pause. Good. The word landed with surprising weight. The seminar ended soon after. Chairs scraped back, conversations resumed. Graham packed his bag with deliberate calm, aware, achingly aware, that Verhoeven was still watching him. He waited until the room had mostly emptied before standing. He told himself it was coincidence. Timing. Nothing more. As he reached the aisle, Verhoeven spoke. Mr. Charles. Graham turned. Up close, the professor was more unsettling. The lines at the corners of his eyes suggested restraint rather than age. His expression was composed, but there was something taut beneath it, like a thought held too carefully. You argued as if you'd already had this conversation with the text, Verhoeven said. Graham shrugged lightly. I read closely. A faint smile touched Verhoeven's mouth, not warmth. Appreciation. I'm assembling a small research group, he said. Advanced work. Translation. Analysis. I'd like you to consider joining. The offer was unexpected. Graham felt a flash of pride, quickly followed by caution. I'm already assisting another faculty member, he replied. I know, Verhoeven said. The ease of the response unsettled him more than it should have. Verhoeven stepped back slightly, restoring distance. Think about it, he added. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys staying comfortable for long. Their eyes met again. This time the look was different. Not assessment. Not curiosity. Recognition. Graham felt it then, clearly, undeniably. This was not admiration alone. There was something coiled beneath the professor's composure. Something watchful. Wanting. And worse, something that saw him not as a student to be guided, but as a presence to be reckoned with. As Graham left the room, heart beating too fast, one thought followed him like a shadow. Dr. Ilya Verhoeven hadn't just noticed him. He had claimed his attention. And Graham wasn't sure whether he wanted to resist, or step closer and see how deep that gaze could go. Graham told himself the restlessness was professional. That it had nothing to do with the way Dr. Verhoeven's voice resurfaced in his thoughts at odd hours, or how the memory of that steady gaze unsettled him in moments meant for quiet focus. He repeated this lie as he crossed the faculty corridor 2 weeks later, manuscript folder tucked under his arm, pulse inexplicably quickening with each step. The door to Verhoeven's office was ajar. Light spilled out, warm, amber, deliberate. Graham hesitated before knocking, aware of how absurd the pause was. This was an academic meeting. He was a postgraduate researcher, not a boy hovering on the edge of something unnamed. Come in, Verhoeven said before Graham could knock. Of course. The office was spare but intentional. Shelves arranged by era rather than author. Margins of annotated books visible, bristling with colored tabs. A single window overlooked the quad, rain streaking the glass like restless fingers. Verhoeven stood behind his desk, jacket removed, sleeves rolled with precise care. He looked up as Graham entered, and again, too quickly, the professor's attention settled, locked, sharpened. You came, Verhoeven said. Graham resisted the urge to bristle at the implication. You asked me to consider. And? I agreed to a trial period, Graham replied. Strictly academic. The corner of Verhoeven's mouth curved faintly. All work worth doing should be defined carefully. Graham took the seat opposite the desk. He placed the folder between them like a boundary line. Verhoeven noticed, eyes flicking down before returning to Graham's face. They worked. At least that was what the hours would later be called. Text unfurled between them, ancient, layered, treacherous in its ambiguity. Graham translated aloud, careful and exacting. Verhoeven listened without interruption, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded in concentration. Occasionally he corrected Graham. Not sharply. Not gently either. Just enough to remind him who held the broader map. You're imposing modern desire onto the phrasing, Verhoeven said at one point. I disagree, Graham replied without looking up. The ambiguity is intentional. The author wants the reader complicit. Verhoeven leaned back slowly. The chair creaked, a sound that felt indecently loud. Say more. Graham did. He spoke with growing conviction, words tumbling faster as he followed the thread of his own insight. When he finally looked up, breath shallow, he found Verhoeven watching him with something like restrained fascination. That hunger, Verhoeven said quietly, is what makes scholars careless. Graham stiffened. Or honest. Pause. Verhoeven stood, moving around the desk. He stopped beside Graham's chair, not touching, not crowding, but close enough that Graham could sense him. Presence. Honesty, Verhoeven said, is rarely neutral. The words settled between them, dense with implication. Graham swallowed, acutely aware of how easily this could slide into something unprofessional. He forced himself to meet the professor's eyes. Are we still discussing the text? He asked. Verhoeven's gaze flicked briefly to Graham's mouth before returning to his eyes. Always. They resumed work with greater formality. Distance restored. Or so Graham told himself. Yet the air felt altered, as if something had been named without being spoken. When the clock chimed the hour, Graham gathered his things with visible restraint. I should go, he said. Verhoeven nodded once. Of course. Graham reached the door before the professor spoke again. "You should be careful, Mr. Charles." The words were calm, even mild. But something in the tone set Graham's nerves alight. "Careful of what?" he asked, turning. Verhoeven regarded him thoughtfully. "Of what you invite." The rain had stopped by the time Graham left the building, but the tension followed him all the way home. Over the next weeks, their meetings became routine and dangerous. They worked late. Too late. Long after the faculty corridors emptied, after the hum of the building settled into silence. Verhoeven never crossed a line, not overtly. But the lines themselves began to blur. Praise came sparingly, and when it did, it lingered. "You're sharper than you realize," Verhoeven said once, eyes fixed on Graham's notes. "But you hide behind restraint." Another time, "You challenge authority instinctively. That usually comes from disappointment." Graham never asked how Verhoeven knew these things. He began to notice patterns. How the professor positioned himself when Graham spoke, always angled toward him. How criticism was delivered softly, privately, while approval was public, deliberate. And how the gaze, always the gaze, followed him. It unnerved Graham to admit how much he wanted it. The rumor reached him on a Thursday afternoon. 2 doctoral candidates whispering near the archives. A pause when Graham approached. Averted eyes. "He's intense," one of them murmured, too late. Graham felt a cold wash of awareness. He confronted Verhoeven that evening, heart hammering harder than any academic disagreement warranted. "People are talking," Graham said, standing rather than sitting. "About us." Verhoeven's expression darkened, not with anger but with calculation. "And," he asked. "And I won't be the subject of speculation," Graham said. "Not for your work. Not for your interest." A beat. Verhoeven removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk. The gesture felt deliberate. Exposing. "You think this is about interest," he said. "Isn't it?" Verhoeven studied him, truly studied him, as if weighing the cost of honesty. "I think," he said slowly, "that you mistake control for intent." Graham's breath caught. "I maintain distance," Verhoeven continued, "because proximity would be irresponsible." The word landed heavy. "And yet," Graham said quietly, "you never look away." The silence that followed was vast. Finally, Verhoeven spoke. "Neither do you." The truth of it vibrated through Graham's chest. "I won't jeopardize your work," Verhoeven said, voice lower now. "Or your reputation. If this collaboration ends here, say the word." Graham should have said it. He didn't. "I don't want to stop," he admitted. "I just need to know where the ground is." Verhoeven stepped back as if giving Graham space to breathe. "The ground," he said, "is consent. And clarity." His eyes softened, not losing intensity but gaining restraint. "Nothing more," he added. "Unless you choose otherwise." Graham nodded, pulse loud in his ears. As he left the office that night, one realization settled inescapably in his mind. The danger was no longer in crossing boundaries. It was in how desperately he wanted to stand right at their edge and see who would fall first. The distance came quietly. Not announced, not argued, just enacted. Graham noticed it first in the small things. The way Dr. Verhoeven no longer lingered in doorways. How their meetings ended precisely on the hour now, never drifting into the late, breathless stretches that had once blurred time. The gaze remained, but it was tempered, leashed. Professional. Too professional. At first, Graham told himself this was relief. This was what boundaries looked like when they held. Yet something in his chest ached with an unfamiliar sharpness, like a limb gone numb after being held too tightly for too long. The work suffered for it. Not in quality, if anything, Graham became more meticulous, but in spirit. Their exchanges grew efficient, stripped of the charged silences and layered meaning that had once made every discussion feel alive. Verhoeven corrected without commentary. Praised without inflection. It was safe. It was unbearable. The rumors, Graham realized, had reached further than he thought. He overheard a senior lecturer mention Verhoeven's intensity, with a knowing lift of the brow. Another warned, sotto voce, that visiting professors rarely stayed long enough to weather scandal. Verhoeven had heard them too. Graham could see it in the way the professor's jaw tightened during faculty gatherings, in how his shoulders squared as if bracing against something unseen. Control had become armor. One evening, Graham arrived at Verhoeven's office to find the lights off. A note waited on the door. "Cancel. We'll reschedule." No signature. No explanation. Graham stood there longer than necessary, staring at the neat handwriting, something hot and restless rising beneath his ribs. This wasn't caution anymore. This was retreat. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. It happened in the archive room, a place of hushed reverence and dust-softened light. Graham found Verhoeven alone, seated at a long table, surrounded by texts they had once planned to translate together. "You're avoiding me," Graham said, the words sharper than he intended. Verhoeven looked up slowly. The flicker in his eyes, surprise then something like relief, was gone in an instant. "I'm being responsible," he replied. "That's not the same thing." Verhoeven closed the book in front of him with deliberate care. "It should be." Graham moved closer, stopping across the table. The distance felt cavernous anyway. "You don't get to decide this alone," Graham said. "Not after everything." Verhoeven's composure cracked. "Not fully, but enough." "Everything," he echoed softly. "You think this has been easy?" Graham faltered. He hadn't expected that. "You're the one with power," he said. "You can step back whenever it suits you." Verhoeven stood abruptly, chair scraping back. The sound echoed, indecently loud in the quiet room. "You mistake authority for immunity," he said, voice low. "Every day I am aware of exactly what I stand to lose." His gaze found Graham's, unshielded now, stripped of its usual restraint. "And what about what I'm losing?" Graham demanded. The question landed between them, fragile and raw. Verhoeven stared at him for a long moment, something tumultuous shifting beneath his calm exterior. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I pulled away because I recognized the danger," he said. "Not to you. To me." Graham's breath caught. "You look at me," Verhoeven continued, "as if you see through every defense I've ever built. As if you already know where I would break." He exhaled slowly. "That terrifies me." The admission rearranged something fundamental in Graham's chest. He had spent weeks feeling pursued, analyzed, claimed. It had never occurred to him that Verhoeven might feel exposed. "You're not weak for wanting," Graham said carefully. Verhoeven gave a humorless smile. "Wanting is the weakness." Graham stepped closer, the table no longer a barrier but a formality. "Then let me choose," he said. "Let me decide whether that weakness is mine too." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Not charged with dominance but with possibility. Verhoeven searched his face as if looking for hesitation, for doubt. He found none. "You don't understand what you're offering," he said. "I understand exactly," Graham replied. "You've been teaching me how to read between lines since the day we met." Verhoeven closed his eyes briefly, a fracture finally visible. When he opened them again, the gaze that met Graham's was no longer controlled. It was bare. "If we continue," Verhoeven said, "it cannot be in half measures. I won't pretend this is casual. And I won't hide behind authority." Graham's pulse thundered. "Good," he said. "I'm done pretending too." They did not touch. The restraint was almost painful, but deliberate. A choice rather than a denial. Verhoeven stepped back first, putting space between them with visible effort. "We end the research arrangement," he said. "Formally." "Immediately." Graham nodded. The cost was clear. The sacrifice unmistakable. "And after?" Graham asked. Verhoeven met his eyes again, the corner of his mouth lifting with something like reverence. "After, if you still want this, we start without titles." The decision settled between them, heavy, irrevocable. Graham left the archive room feeling unsteady, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Yet for the first time since the distance began, the ache in his chest eased. The fracture had not destroyed them. It had revealed the truth. Dr. Ilya Verhoeven was no longer the man who watched from behind authority and restraint. And Graham Charles was no longer content to be the one who waited. Whatever came next would be chosen. Together. The day the paperwork was finalized, the university felt suddenly unfamiliar. Graham stood on the steps outside the faculty building, the autumn air crisp against his skin, and tried to reconcile the strange lightness in his chest with the reality of what he had just done. The research appointment, coveted, prestigious, was over. Ended cleanly, professionally, with signatures and polite nods and no hint of scandal. He should have felt loss. Instead, he felt free. He didn't see Ilya for 3 days after that. Not in the corridors. Not across the quad. Not even as a passing shadow at lectures Graham no longer attended. The absence was deliberate, another act of restraint, another unspoken agreement to let the dust settle. On the 4th evening, Graham received a message. "If you're still willing, come to the river walk at sunset." No title. No formality. Just Ilya. The river was quiet, the surface catching the dying light like a held breath. Graham spotted him immediately, standing near the railing, coat unbuttoned, hair stirred by the breeze. Without the rigid frame of the university around him, Ilya looked different. Less contained. More human. He turned as Graham approached. For a moment, neither spoke. The gaze returned, inevitable, familiar, but it had changed. Where once it had claimed, weighed, tested, now it waited. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Ilya said. Graham stopped a step away. "You knew I would." Ilya smiled then, fully unguarded. It softened his features in a way Graham had never seen before. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." They walked along the river in companionable silence. The city hummed distantly, life carrying on as if nothing monumental had shifted. Graham was acutely aware of the space between them, how easily it could close, how intentionally it remained. "I've spent years believing control was the same as safety," Ilya said eventually. "That if I wanted carefully enough, nothing could be taken from me. And now?" Graham asked. "And now I know that control is just fear in better clothing." Graham glanced at him, heart tightening. "You're not afraid now?" Ilya stopped walking. He turned fully to Graham, the river behind him darkening into night. "I am," he said honestly. "But it's different. I'm afraid because this matters." Graham felt something warm bloom behind his ribs. "Good," he said softly. "So am I." The touch came slowly. Ilya lifted his hand as if asking permission without words. Graham stepped closer, closing the last inch himself. When Ilya's fingers brushed his cheek, the contact was reverent, not possessive. "This," Ilya said, voice unsteady, "is where domination ends." Graham leaned into the touch, eyes fluttering shut. "No," he murmured. "This is where it changes." Ilya laughed quietly, a sound of disbelief and relief intertwined. He rested his forehead against Graham's, breath warm, grounding. "I don't want to command you," he said. "I want to choose you." Graham opened his eyes. "Then choose me." The kiss was inevitable. It was not urgent. Not consuming. It unfolded slowly, like a truth finally allowed into the open. Ilya's hand slid from Graham's cheek to the back of his neck, steady but gentle. Graham responded instinctively, fingers curling into Ilya's coat, anchoring himself. When they parted, both were breathing unevenly. "I've never felt weaker," Ilya admitted. Graham smiled. "I've never felt stronger." They laughed then, the tension breaking at last, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like hope. Weeks passed. They learned each other outside the charged confines of academia. Coffee shops instead of offices. Long conversations that drifted from literature to childhood to quiet fears neither had voiced before. Ilya listened as much as he spoke. Graham challenged him without defiance, without fear. Power, Graham realized, hadn't vanished. It had equalized. One evening, as they lay tangled together on Ilya's sofa, the city lights flickering through the window, Graham traced idle patterns on Ilya's chest. "You still look at me the same way," Graham said. Ilya caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "No," he said. "I look at you better." Graham tilted his head. "Meaning?" "Before," Ilya said thoughtfully, "I saw desire and the impulse to dominate it. Now I see longing, and the strength it takes to surrender to it." Graham's throat tightened. "You're not weak for loving," he said. Ilya met his gaze, eyes steady, unflinching. "No," he agreed. "I'm brave." The words settled into Graham like a promise. Months later, on a quiet evening much like the first, they returned to the river walk. The air was warmer now, the world softer. Ilya laced their fingers together openly, without hesitation. "Do you regret it?" Ilya asked. Graham shook his head immediately. "Do you?" Ilya smiled, eyes reflecting the water, the lights, the life they'd chosen. "Not for a moment." They stood there, watching the current move steadily forward, neither of them trying to control its course. In Ilya's eyes, Graham no longer saw domination or danger. He saw devotion. And in Graham's gaze, Ilya found not temptation, but home.